3 terrifying forest encounters. Back in 2019, when I had just turned 21 years old, I was spending the entire summer at my parents' house and figured I'd go camping in the woods that stretched out behind their property while I had the perfect chance. This was a pretty spontaneous trip that I decided on. I just woke up one morning and thought I'd pack my bag and head out for the night. I'd done this exact same thing a bunch of times before, so this wasn't some special or unique camping trip or anything like that. I let my parents know exactly where I was headed, then left around 4 in the afternoon to find a good spot for the night. I walked for a solid hour before finding an open area that looked nice enough for what I needed. I got my tent set up properly, cleared out a decent space around it, and lit up a small campfire to get things going. It was really cozy and peaceful, and the sun slowly setting behind the trees made it even better than I expected. This was exactly the kind of night I was hoping for when I decided to come out here. But it really didn't take that long at all for it to get interrupted in a way I wasn't expecting. The sun was just about to pass behind the top of the trees when I heard a voice, a male voice, sort of muttering or talking to himself. I almost felt like it was echoing a bit though, because it was really hard to pinpoint exactly where the voice was coming from in the forest. It was also getting dark enough where the shadows from all the trees made it really hard to see much of anything clearly. I probably should have mentioned that these woods behind my parents' place were pretty vast and unexplored, as in there were no real trails around here anywhere. So running into someone out here would have to be very coincidental and strange. I thought they'd likely just pass by on their way to wherever they were going, and that would be the end of it. But I continued hearing the voice for probably 5 minutes straight, which was long enough that it seemed they weren't just walking through and were maybe staying near me on purpose for some reason. Eventually, I decided to call out, just yelling hello loudly to see if they'd respond back to me. But before I even finished speaking the word completely, the voice cut out immediately. The forest was now completely silent around me. I felt really uncomfortable about the whole situation, and ended up calling out again to see if I'd get any response. No voice or response came back to me. Now I was definitely on the creeped out side of things. With only 20 or 30 minutes left of that thin layer of sunlight filtering through the trees, I decided I would just move spots entirely. There was no need to stay there and be creeped out all night and let it ruin my entire camping experience. Within a couple minutes I was heading back into the trees and looking for another place to call home for the night ahead. I didn't have as much luck this time around. 15 minutes into my search, with the fading sunlight rushing me to make a decision, I decided to just settle where I was at that moment. Basically, I was just among all the trees without any real clearing. It was a good thing I did though, because by the time I finished setting up camp again, there was no light left whatsoever. The sun was fully down and the woods were dead silent around me. I found it calming though, knowing I'd be able to hear clearly if that guy came back around for whatever reason he had been hanging around earlier. I built up another small campfire to keep me warm and provide some light. I enjoyed the warmth for a while before grabbing my snack bag and taking out some stuff to make s'mores for myself. I got a small stick and stabbed a marshmallow on the top of it and held it over the fire carefully. I don't know what it was about it exactly, but roasting a marshmallow over a campfire is just one of my absolute favorite things to do when I'm camping. It really helped get my mind off of the strange things that had happened earlier. I made a few s'mores and hung around the fire for a good long while, several hours at least by my estimation. It was pretty late by then, and I was letting the fire begin dying out slowly. It was still somewhat bright and providing light, but only about half as much as it was before when I first got it going. But then I heard the distinct crunch of leaves somewhere behind me. I thought it sounded like it was coming from somewhere to the back left of my campsite area. It was completely dark though, and once I was looking over in that direction, whatever it was had stopped moving entirely. Again, I called out into the darkness. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much of anything considering how the last time went when I tried this. But a few moments later, a man actually stepped out of the woods and into the light from my campfire, though it startled me because he came from a completely different area than what I was looking at when I heard the noise. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said with what seemed like a friendly smile as he casually walked up to the fire and sat down right next to it like he belonged there. He held his hands out to warm them by the fire that I had built. He acted as if he were supposed to be there, or like he knew me personally or something along those lines. Can I help you with something? I think you're at the wrong campsite," I said, trying to be polite but firm. "No, he said simply. I didn't know which part of what I said he was saying no to, but either way it was a really unsettling response that he didn't add anything more to. I sort of had to think for a few seconds about what to do or say next in this weird situation. So there was a very strange and tense little bit of time as we both sat by the fire, not speaking to each other at all. It got so tense and uncomfortable that I sort of just asked whatever came to mind first, which in hindsight I probably shouldn't have done. Do you happen to be the one I heard talking out in the trees around my other campsite earlier tonight? I asked him directly. The man stayed looking at the fire, but his face visibly fell completely flat and emotionless. Must have been someone else out there, he said with a much colder and more monotone voice than before. Something was extremely off about all this, but I still didn't know how to get out of it without risking causing some kind of trouble. Before I was able to think too much about what my next move should be, a stick cracked loudly behind me. I looked back toward the sound. It was coming from the same spot to the back left of the campsite where I'd heard the first noise. My heart absolutely sank when I realized what this meant. The man sitting by my fire wasn't alone out here. Someone else was here with him, hiding in the darkness. I turned and looked back toward the campfire where the man was sitting. He was staring directly at me now. To be perfectly honest, I don't even remember whether he was smiling or angry, or what expression he had, because all I remember was the intense cold and dead look in his eyes that made my blood run cold. I instantly sprung up from my chair and made a dead sprint into the trees as fast as my legs could carry me. I heard one of the men say something loudly, clearly talking to the other one in frustration, and momentarily I heard footsteps running up behind me through the underbrush. However, as I got deeper into the woods and into the complete darkness, I managed to lose them entirely. Having grown up in these woods as my backyard for my entire childhood, I was still able to somewhat navigate through them even in the dark and eventually make it to the road, following it all the way back to my parents' house. They immediately called 911 for me when I told them what had happened. Long story short, I led a team of officers back to the campsite the next morning to investigate. Everything was completely gone when we got there. I don't know if that makes things better or worse for me to think about. On one hand, it could have meant they were just there to rob me of my camping gear, but on the other hand, it made it definite that they had bad intentions planned, so they really could have been trying to do absolutely anything to me. After all, one of them did chase me for a solid minute through the woods. It shouldn't surprise anyone to say that I never went back in those woods behind my parents' house ever again after that experience. It was the middle of summer, and being someone who was an avid backpacker and camper, I'd heard from one of my buddies about these old fire lookouts that you could actually rent for camping. Apparently, they were retired lookout stations that had been used by forest services, usually located in the middle of nowhere, miles and miles into the forest with no civilization around. The one I chose for my trip was pretty much the most isolated one I could find anywhere in the area. It was easier to rent than others, having available slots basically through the whole summer. And I liked hiking anyway, so the distance didn't bother me. There was only a single picture I could find of it online though, and it was super old and blurry, so really I had absolutely no clue what to expect of the actual lookout tower. I knew it was built way back in the 1950s, so it would definitely be old and probably showing its age. But as far as how much restoration or maintenance work had been done to it over the years, I was going in completely blind. I brought my usual backpacking gear and started the long hike at 9 in the morning sharp. There wasn't much out there as far as views go, at least not for the first few hours of hiking. It was just very dense, harsh forest terrain that seemed to go on forever. The trail wasn't even much of a real trail anymore either. It was just a very rough path that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. After 5 long hours of hiking though, I finally got my first glimpse of the lookout tower in the distance. It was still far away, sitting at the top of a mountain peak. It looked very small from where I was, and wasn't one of those that was high up on stilts like some lookout towers are. It looked more like a small cabin than anything else, maybe raised up only 10 to 15 feet off the ground. There was another full hour of trekking before I actually got there and could see it up close. The hike was definitely worth it just for the incredible view alone. I felt like I could see the whole world spread out before me from up there. The fire lookout itself was in pretty rough shape, however, very noticeably old, with some obvious patchwork here and there done to certain parts of it. It had a wraparound staircase of 20 or so steps leading up to the walkway that went around the entire lookout building, and the inside was completely empty of any furniture or supplies. It wasn't glamorous by any means, but honestly it could have been much worse than what I found. And to have this utterly incredible view, I'd take these conditions any day. With a few hours of sunlight still left in the day, I tossed my bag down, made some food for myself, and relaxed on the outer ledge to take in the scenery. It was incredibly quiet up there, with just the peaceful sound of birds chirping and wind blowing through the trees below. I was pretty beat and exhausted from the long hike up the mountain, so after the sun fell past the horizon and darkness began to set in, I threw my sleeping stuff down on the wooden floorboards and laid down to rest. It was only around 8 o'clock, so even though I was exhausted from all the hiking, I couldn't quite fall asleep as fast as I wanted to. I think 30 to 40 minutes went by while I was lying there trying to fall asleep. Then I thought I heard something outside the lookout tower. Before I could even get up and look out the window to see what it was, there were clear footsteps coming up the wooden stairs outside. I hurried out of my sleeping bag and up to the door as quickly as I could, which notably had no locks on it whatsoever. A few seconds later, a man came around the corner of the walkway. He was older, I'd say late 40s, and had longish blonde hair that looked unkempt. Somehow he wasn't startled at all when he saw me standing there, almost like he already knew I was up here waiting for him. "Great place to stay a few nights, isn't it?" he said with a wide grin, walking up closer to me. I agreed with him, still feeling a little nervous about the situation, and mentioned that I had booked it for the next 3 nights total. I was already feeling a little put off though, because I knew there was absolutely nothing else around here for miles. So him being here while I was also here was really strange and unlikely. I asked him if he was camping somewhere around here in the area. "Actually, I was hoping to be staying here tonight," he said again with that same grin on his face. I wasn't sure how to respond to that request, but I ended up just saying sorry and that I had already reserved it. "Well, it looks like you've got enough room in there for both of us." "I mean, it's just you here by yourself, right?" he asked, looking past me into the empty lookout. After hesitating for a second, I decided to lie, saying that a friend of mine was just a few minutes out on the trail, and that unfortunately we couldn't let him stay here with us for the night. He looked at me for a moment, his grin slowly fading from his face, and didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. Then he just nodded once and started to leave, turning around to head back down the stairs. It wasn't until he turned around to head back down the stairs that I noticed he didn't have a backpack or any gear at all with him. Surely he had to have left his pack somewhere nearby if he was really camping out here. I couldn't see why anyone would be this far isolated in the wilderness without any camping gear at all, even if they were somehow planning on using the fire lookout as their shelter for the night. I got some really uneasy feelings about that man and his intentions, so I stayed up quite a bit longer than planned and just stared down at the forest below the lookout, scanning for any signs of movement. I did end up getting really sleepy though eventually, and got back in my sleeping bag and passed out for the night. I woke up in the morning feeling much better, and spending the first hour making coffee and enjoying the absolutely incredible view from up there. When I headed down from the lookout though, there was a note attached to the wooden railing at the very bottom of the stairs. It was just a simple piece of paper with the word sorry written on it in pen with a smiley face drawn next to it. I assumed it had to be from that guy who had visited the night before, but if he put this note here, then he must have come back sometime in the middle of the night while I was sleeping soundly. I immediately felt really unsettled just thinking about the implications of that. The fact that he even left a note at all was just weird and didn't make much sense to me. Despite the strange occurrence, I decided to go for a walk around the area. Maybe it was also to scan the area for any signs of the man still being around somewhere, because clearly he hadn't left the area when he should have. I wandered around the forest down the hill from the fire lookout for quite a while. There wasn't much to see though in terms of anything interesting. It was all the same dense forest terrain that I'd hiked up through the previous day, and I didn't notice any obvious campsites or personal things left behind anyway. I went back up to the lookout and enjoyed the peace and quiet for the rest of that day. I stayed up much later than I did the night before, wanting to really soak in the experience. I had this small battery-powered lantern that I hung up on the wall inside so I could see a little better in the darkness, and I just sort of existed up there peacefully. I thought about whatever random things came to mind and stared out at the darkness beyond the lookout, only slightly being able to make out the faint outline of the mountains in the distance. I want to say I didn't start getting ready for bed until nearly midnight. It could have even been 1 in the morning by that point. I set out all my sleeping stuff, then grabbed my lantern and headed down the steps into the forest to take a leak real quick before settling in for the night. I walked up just to the edge of the tree line where it met the clearing around the lookout, but as I got there I saw something move in front of me in the darkness. Just a quick glimpse of something shifting out of the dim light from my lantern. I froze completely still for a second, then held the lantern up further forward, although it didn't help much with the visibility. "Someone there?" I called out into the darkness. The complete silence that followed my voice made things feel even more eerie and unsettled. I basically ran back to the lookout as fast as I could. It didn't feel much safer inside there though, to be perfectly honest. Windows covered every single inch of the walls, and like I mentioned before, the door didn't even have a lock on it. Part of me really wanted to just pack up and leave right then and there. But heading out now while it was pitch black outside, and with the trail being nearly non-existent in some places, would probably be much worse and more dangerous than just staying put for the night. I kept the lantern hung up on the wall inside, and looked out through the windows at the forest below the lookout. It was really eerie knowing that with the light on inside, if someone was actually out there watching, they could probably see me clearly in the window. Meanwhile, all I could see looking out was complete darkness. I could see the bottom of the stairs though from one of the windows, so that's what I was focusing on most, making sure nobody tried to come up them again like the night before. The longer I stayed there watching and waiting, the more this terrible sense of unease started to fill my entire body. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I decided to pack up all my stuff just in case. At least then I could make a run for it if I absolutely had to. As I stuffed everything into my backpack, I would stop every 30 seconds and go back up to the window to look out at the stairs, then continue packing, repeating this process over and over until I finally got everything packed in my bag and ready to go. I set my packed bag up against the wall, then went back to the window to continue keeping watch. There was a man standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was standing right at the very first step, staring up at the lookout like he was just waiting there patiently for some. I could only see part of him through all the wooden railings and supports, but I was absolutely sure it was the same man from yesterday. He had no backpack on and looked about the same height and build. I was beyond terrified at this point. Why was he back again? And why was he just standing there completely motionless at the bottom of the steps? What if he decided to come up again like last time? All of these thoughts and more were making my mind race with possibility. I must have been at the window watching him for 2 whole minutes before the man finally moved at all. He took a couple steps backward, pausing for a moment, then walked off in another direction. The way he went though was blocked off from my view by the walkway structure, so I lost sight of him completely. And if he did keep walking in that direction toward the forest, it was far too dark for me to be able to tell where he went. In that moment I felt absolutely certain the man was stalking me, or at least keeping watch of me and creeping up way too close for comfort, especially in the middle of the night like this. It could have just been my gut telling me something important, but I felt like if I stayed any longer, something really bad was going to happen to me. I waited a few more minutes to be safe. Then I grabbed my bag and as quietly as possible walked down the steps into the area below the lookout tower. I can't even begin to describe how unnerved and terrified I was walking away from the tower and into the dark forest, knowing there was a real chance the guy was still out there watching me, or possibly following me into the trees. For that very reason I kept my pocket knife open and in my hand the entire time I was walking. I walked for about 15 minutes, which was when the trail started to get a lot less defined and harder to follow, so I was forced to pull out my lantern to see where I was going. I hoped I was far enough away by then that the man hadn't followed me and wouldn't be able to see the light from my lantern. The next 5 hours were exhaustingly unsettling and nerve-wracking. By then though, the sun had finally come up and I was able to finish the hike safely and leave the forest entirely. I think it's really hard to fully put into perspective just how horrifying those nights were for me. Something deep inside me knew there was something really bad about that man and his intentions toward me. One thing I keep thinking back on is that I had told the man I booked the tower for 3 nights total, which leaves absolutely no reason for him to have come back multiple times to check if I was still there. It also means he very likely thought I'd be there for the 3rd night as well. So had I not left early and actually stayed for that 3rd night like I originally planned, things might have taken a much more disturbing and dangerous turn. I was driving from northern Montana all the way up to Alaska for an epic road trip. I had converted my SUV into a proper camping rig and was spending 2 full months traveling and camping out of it on the road. And the main goal of those 2 months was specifically to drive the famous Alaska Highway. This road was famous for a good reason. It went through the remote western portion of Canada and was known to be very desolate and rough in many sections. I knew that beforehand from my research, so I came in as prepared as possible for the long journey ahead. Of everything to be nervous about though, the one thing that had me feeling a bit more vulnerable than usual was that because I had to drive through Canada, I couldn't bring any firearm with me across the border. Usually I always carried a piece tucked under my seat just as a means to protect myself in an emergency situation. But for this particular trip I couldn't do that. Anyway, the first day of driving went really well overall. I got in a good 8 hours of driving without any major issue. Most of this section of the road was a little less desolate than the next portion that was coming up. The next part of the highway only had a gas station every couple hundred miles, so I had to stop and fill up every single time I saw one and be very careful about how efficiently I drove. By sundown I was just about ready to pass out from exhaustion. I pulled off on the next campsite I saw along the highway. Out on this road there were official rest stops every once in a while, but there were also a ton of small trails that just led to empty wooded camping. Those were always the ones I preferred to use. Since it was already getting late though, I didn't get much of a look at the lot I pulled into. It just looked like thick forest all around me and nobody else was there camping. So I put up my window shades for privacy, hopped in the back seat of my converted SUV, and slept soundly until morning. Everything seemed perfectly fine when I woke up. I had gotten really good sleep and didn't wake up at all during the night from any disturbance. Before hitting the road again though, I wanted to stretch my legs properly and get a good walk in after being cramped in the car. Right when I stepped outside my vehicle, I noticed there was a small trail leading into the woods, so I decided to follow it and see where it went. It wasn't very long though, which was a bit disappointing. I think I walked maybe 5 minutes at most before getting to another campsite deeper in the woods. But something didn't feel right about this place at all. It was scrappy and rugged looking. Clearly someone had been camping there very recently, and it sort of looked like they had left in a real hurry for some reason. Half of their camping stuff was completely missing and the other half was torn up and thrown across the entire site in a mess. After only being there for about 30 seconds and taking in the scene, I turned around and headed back toward my car immediately. I didn't know if someone was still around the area somewhere, but I trusted my gut instinct and walked back to my vehicle as quickly as possible. When I got back to where I had parked though, there was now a truck parked right up next to my car that definitely wasn't there before. It was an all-black pickup truck with heavily tinted windows. Nobody was outside of it anywhere, so I assumed they were sitting inside watching me as I got up to my car and climbed it. With the strange and disturbing campsite I had just discovered and this sudden truck parked near me out in the middle of such an isolated road in the forest, I just left right away without any hesitation. I didn't even have to think about whether or not something was actually wrong because getting out of there quickly was obviously the right answer. I drove for 3 to 4 hours straight after leaving that campsite until I finally got to the next gas station on the highway. I pulled in to fill up my tank. This gas station looked very old and run down and only had one double-sided pump for vehicles. Nobody else was there when I arrived. I got out and started the pump to fill my tank. I have to say the views were absolutely incredible out there with massive mountains in every single direction, so I didn't mind waiting a while for the slow gas pump to fill up my car completely. However, after a few minutes of waiting, I saw a truck coming down the road in the distance. As it got closer to the gas station, I was almost completely sure it was the exact same black truck I'd seen at the campsite earlier that morning. My stomach tightened up with anxiety when they pulled into the gas station and drove right up to the other side of the same pump I was using. Of course, it made perfect sense they'd be getting gas since you kind of had to stop at every station on this remote road. But it still felt more than a little strange to me. Why would they have pulled into that campsite and only stayed there for a few minutes just to leave right after I did? Seemed like too much of a coincidence. Thankfully, I was done filling up in about 30 seconds, getting back in my car and driving off as quickly as possible. I think part of what made it all feel so off and wrong was that I never actually saw the driver of the truck. He never got out of the vehicle or showed himself in any way, so it just made everything feel much more unusual and suspicious than it should have. Regardless of my concerns, I felt good knowing that now with my tank completely full, I'd be driving non-stop for quite a while, likely putting a ton of distance between us and getting to just enjoy the incredible scenery along the way. Also, I'd hopefully be far enough ahead to find a proper campsite during daylight hours so I wouldn't be parking anywhere blind like I did the previous night. I drove for a long while, pretty much until I noticed the sun starting to come down behind the mountain. Then I found what looked like a decent spot to pull off the highway for the night. It felt a lot more hidden and secure than the last place. The trail sort of nestled away in the thick brush, and there weren't any obvious signs of anyone having been camping here recently, so it definitely wasn't a popular or well-known place to camp overnight. I felt much more safe and secure here than I did the night before. I really wanted to set up my tent outside and have a nice proper outdoor campsite since it was way more spacious and comfortable than sleeping all cramped up in the back of my car. But something inside me told me not to do that just in case something went wrong. So I just made food outside and enjoyed being in nature until sundown, then climbed back into my car to sleep. The next day was hopefully going to be shorter in terms of driving than the last two had been, and knowing that, I decided to stay up later and watch some videos on my phone that I had downloaded for the trip. I was there awake for probably 4 hours total, just relaxing and watching videos. I felt very comfortable and safe there and was actually really excited about getting into Alaska the next morning to start that part of my adventure. But then around 11 at night I heard something outside my car that immediately got my attention. Even from just a second of listening carefully, I was 100% sure it was a person walking around outside. The dry sticks and leaves on the ground made it very loud and distinct from any animal sound. I quickly put my phone down and sat up to look out the window to see what was happening. But I was beaten to it. A man's face was pressed up directly against the side window, staring in at me with an intense expression. I could barely see him clearly in the darkness, but there was absolutely no mistaking that that was what I was seeing. I jolted back in terror, losing my breath completely from the instant fear that shot through my body. The man also moved back immediately, disappearing into the complete darkness just past the window. I immediately jumped up to the front seat, seeing a second guy that I'd heard walking around running up to my car from another direction. He smashed open the back window with something just as I got to the front seat and was reaching for my keys. My adrenaline flowing through my body made it extremely hard to do the simple task of getting my keys out of my pocket and starting the car engine. That, combined with also having to look back at what the two men were doing to my vehicle, made everything more difficult. One of them was running up to my driver's side window while the other was sticking his entire arm through the broken back window, trying to open the door from the inside. In the complete panic of the moment, I somehow managed to get the keys into the ignition and turn the engine on right as he managed to open the back door. I absolutely floored the gas pedal and sped away as fast as possible. As I pulled out of the area, I passed by that same black pickup truck parked off the path, sort of hidden in the bushes where I couldn't see it before. They had followed me all this way from that morning. I drove about a mile down the road, then pulled off to close the back door that was still hanging wide open and to call the police with what little cell service I could get out there. Obviously, being out in the middle of absolute nowhere, it took forever for anyone to respond, and the two men were probably long gone by then anyway. I never managed to get their license plate number, and it was far too dark to get any clear facial features, so it was basically a lost cause from the start. Despite the absolutely horrible experience, I still ended up making it to Alaska successfully and enjoying the rest of my trip after getting the window properly repaired. What both of those men were intending to do, breaking into a car in the middle of the woods at night, knowing full well that I was inside, is left to speculation. I prefer to not even think about the possibility.